We have with us international editor of the SABC, that's Sophie Mokoena, and journalist as well as independent author Hopewell. Good evening to you both, and thank you so much for your time. Perhaps, Sophie, let's just start with the story that is of course a focus at this hour as well. We just spoke to the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, and this is around the Democratic Alliance saying that it went to the US, it's concluded its working visit, it met with including advisors to the Secretary of State, lawmakers, Congress, etc.
Well, I think this is not something new, the engagement of the political parties in South Africa, some of them, not all of them, with the United States of America. You would recall ahead of elections, that's what they were doing. You'd recall that the DA even wrote a letter to the US asking the US to monitor the elections in South Africa, and that led to an uproar in terms of other political parties. So this is not something new. They've always had an ear of the United States of America, particularly the embassy. The former ambassador used to engage with them and other political parties. So this is not something new. Now it's about this. But perhaps I think what is critical is that all political parties and stakeholders, including ordinary South Africans, can go to the United States of America and present South Africa's case. And I think they were doing just that. But the irony is that when other parties are doing the same with other countries that are not of interest to certain political parties, then they get criticized. Who would forget at the moment when the leader of the DA went to Kyiv supporting Ukraine and saying South Africa's relations with Russia are questionable, and supporting America at that time. That was hard on South Africa in terms of the relationship with Russia. Today, what's happening? The Americans are very close to the Russians. In fact, Putin is so close to President Trump right now on issues of Ukraine and many others. There were even reports that the U.S. administration is talking to the Russian Federation to facilitate the talks with Iran. And therefore, this is global politics. That's how they are. That is why at some point in time, when I was speaking to the former South African President, Thabo Mbeki, about this issue of South Africa and the U.S., he pointed out that South Africa must also go and talk to their former friends who supported them during apartheid. Let's take a listen to what Mbeki had to say on the issue of U.S. and also South Africa.
We differed with the Bush administration on Iran. We differed on their war against Iraq and engaged them. President Bush, we talked directly, him and me, and differed on these things. But there were never any imposition of sanctions because we're differing on these issues. And indeed, I must say, even when President Trump, during his first term, he sent an ambassador here, a very good ambassador, who came, even spoke to me. I was no longer in government, but she was very, very clear that in terms of the things that she had to do as a U.S. ambassador in South Africa, she had to make sure that it was in agreement even with me, whatever the issues were. So I'm saying that for decades we've had this kind of relationship with Republicans, both during the anti-apartheid struggle as well as in government. Why there is sudden this changeover, even with regard to President Trump? I'm saying when President Trump was president for the first term, he insisted that with regard to U.S. policy towards South Africa, his ambassador here, a lady, had to make sure that she was acting in concert with our government. Now, why all of a sudden this 180-degree turn, I can't account for it. It's not typical of the Republican Party as we've known the Republican Party for 50 years. It isn't. And to make matters worse, then to depend on an absolute fabrication, like this thing that we're persecuting the Afrikaners and this and that and the other, they don't even discuss it. I mean, I would have expected it that if they got information of that kind, they would come. We were with you in the struggle against apartheid. You promised a democratic, non-racial South Africa. Look what we are doing now. So we can then explain ourselves. No, they don't. They take a decision on the basis of a complete falsehood.
And Hopewell, as I bring you into this conversation, quite an interesting turn of events, right? Sophie speaking about what would have been the US's position on the war in Ukraine, and looking at what's happening right now. Let's perhaps start with just last night. And you're looking at President Donald Trump and his contrasting position, one would say, from what the Oval Office displayed towards Ukraine last week.
Well, what happened in the Oval Office was shameful, and I think President Trump is quite aware of it, including his aides. So what we saw yesterday was a de-escalation, which was, I think, also caused by the president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, writing a letter to President Trump to say that he was now ready to sign the deal. I think all of this stuff must have been discussed in London when President Zelensky met with the European leaders. If you noticed how the British Prime Minister handled Trump, it was a typical politician who understands how to handle bullies. He went with a letter from King Charles inviting him for a state visit, and he told him that this was unique and unprecedented, the kind of stuff that Trump likes. So I think what we saw last night when he addressed both houses was a reflection of what they would have discussed, and they realized that they really messed up, because it energized European countries to come together and immediately support Zelensky and Ukraine in a way that we have not seen in recent years.
Do you think, though, Hopewell, that it may have been a move to try and say, we'll support you, or others are saying he was potentially bullied towards agreeing to this, mineral deal and all of that, as he was told he no longer has any cards to play?
Quite clearly, he was bullied. What he wanted was security guarantees to make sure that Russia does not invade again, even after this deal. Trump said that the security he was looking for is found in American companies operating in Russia. And Trump thinks that that would deter Putin from attacking Ukraine again. But one has to understand that what he was demanding was not new. There was a Budapest Agreement in 1994, which the major powers, America, China, Russia, signed up to, giving guarantees, security guarantees to Ukraine in exchange for it giving up its nuclear arsenal. And so it gave up its nuclear arsenal after the breaking up of the Soviet Union. And the 1994 agreement was that it would then be supported militarily in terms of security if something happens to it. But this did not happen because one of the signatories to the agreement was Russia, which then invaded Ukraine, as we all know. So he wanted those security guarantees, but it seems that they were not forthcoming, and I think that is what triggered the fallout with President Trump.
Sophie, he yesterday, starting off with him saying that it's, still reiterating the golden age, that he calls it, that America has entered, and then he speaks, of course, about how his government has done well so far, and then brags about the cost-cutting measures and says that this is what they've had to do over time, and then saying that Lesotho is a country that nobody has heard of, and yet it was benefiting from US aid?
Well, I think here you have to blame those around President Trump in terms of ensuring that that speech was properly edited. You look at facts. One, the person who's very close to President Trump right now and who's very influential, it's Elon Musk. Elon is a South African. He knows Lesotho very well. So you can't say nobody has heard about Lesotho. As we speak, Elon Musk's company, Starlink, has applied for license to operate a satellite in Lesotho. The bidding process will close on the 20th of March, 2025. So I'm saying a person next to the president is so familiar with Lesotho, and therefore how do you allow such a mistake to creep in when the whole world is watching? But it's no surprise. President Trump's language against Africa, we know it very well. He's using some very difficult words, uncomfortable words, demeaning words when he talks about Africa, and he did just that. But the person who's very close to him, he is in the tech business. The raw material and resources you need to be a powerhouse on technology are found on the continent. So you would think that he is aware of such things. And therefore, I think when you do these kinds of things, you make people to rally behind certain countries, particularly when you look at the fallout with the European Union. The European Union bloc was the first bloc to support South Africa when it came under fire from President Trump. But also next week, the European Union delegation will be in the country pushing for stronger ties, political and also trade. And you'd recall at some point in time, this was a powerful bloc in terms of trade with South Africa. And therefore you are pushing people, when you undermine them, to look for alternative friends and alternative markets. And I think these are some of the things a leader, a sitting head of state, must take into consideration. And I would go back to Russia. I mean, Russia is a friend to the very same people that you are having a standoff with, and also that you are kind of demeaning.
And Hopewell, he says he's only just getting started, as he was speaking there last night. And I wonder, what posture does the continent take, especially in light of what has taken place, what he has done so far, and this statement alone, saying we're only just getting started?
Well, I think African leaders and African citizens should not be surprised by the posturing by Donald Trump. This is the second time, the second coming of Donald Trump is the second term. So we have learned a lot from the first term. I think it's important for Africa to understand that sometimes it's going to be left standing alone without the assistance of these big superpowers when it comes to issues like trade. For instance, over 70% of Africa's food comes outside the continent. That is unacceptable. It's important for African countries and the African Union to realize that Africa must stand on its own. We need to trade more amongst ourselves, and we need to deal with the infrastructure that allows that trade to take place. So for instance, the problems that we face in Southern Africa, if Mozambique wants to move goods to Botswana, it faces an impediment in Zimbabwe because the railway system in Zimbabwe is collapsed, it's rotten. And that's the infrastructure that I'm talking about that we need to fix in order for us to be able to trade amongst ourselves, increase the amount of trade that happens amongst ourselves. If you look at South Africa today, South African goods going into Zimbabwe, most of them, they've got 100% tariffs. We are complaining about 10%, 25% tariffs that are being put in place by Donald Trump to the biggest three partners, trading partners for South Africa, which is for America, which is Mexico, Canada, and China. But Zimbabwe charges 100% tariffs on South African goods. So it makes South African goods more expensive in Zimbabwe. And yet Zimbabwe does not have the factories to protect. It's protecting nothing. It's just charging a lot of tariffs. So if we trade amongst ourselves a lot more, remove these tariffs, we will increase the continental GDP and make sure that the infrastructure required for this trade to take place is put in place.
And especially because we're talking about a G20 that, South Africa says it wants to put the continental agenda on the global stage. So certainly the issue of infrastructure, quite a big one, even in some of the working meetings. But thank you both for your time. And that was SABC News International editor Sophie Mokoena, as well as independent author and journalist Hopewell.